All right, so today we're stepping right into the Oval Office during a meeting between then President Trump, VP Pence, and Ukrainian President Zelenskyy.
Wow.
Back in the day, C-SPAN uploaded the video to YouTube, so we have the actual transcript. It's like we're flies on the wall for a moment of history in the making.
This is going to be good.
Yeah, this is a fascinating one for sure. So this meeting wasn't just some photo op and a handshake.
Oh, no. This was a high-stakes situation for sure. It took place during the war in Ukraine, remember? And the future of Ukraine was on the line, but also the relationship between the U.S. and Russia, the stability of Europe. I mean, potentially even the whole global balance of power.
So much at stake.
Yeah.
So let's break it down. What exactly were they trying to accomplish in this meeting?
Well, they were talking about a potential agreement to end the war in Ukraine. But it wasn't just about like a basic ceasefire. It was about securing resources for the U.S., navigating this whole geopolitical mess, and potentially, you know, reshaping global alliances.
Okay, so we've got the war in Ukraine. We've got all these huge issues at play. And then you bring in these big personalities.
Absolutely.
President Trump from the business world. President Zelenskyy leading a country in a fight for its survival.
Yeah, you can just see.
Really different communication styles from what I saw in the transcript.
Oh, absolutely. You can totally see those differences playing out right there in the transcript itself. I mean, President Trump was the leader of the most powerful country in the world at the time. He really tries to control the conversation. And then you've got President Zelenskyy. He's facing immense pressure, obviously. And you can feel that urgency in the way that he pushes back.
Yeah, reading the transcript, it felt like President Trump was laser focused on getting a concrete deal.
Absolutely.
Not just, like I said, a ceasefire, but an agreement that would really benefit the U.S., specifically access to raw earth minerals from Ukraine, and the creation of a fund with revenue from those resources.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that his focus on this deal wasn't just about like economics for him. He really believed that a solid agreement was the key to ending the war. I mean, he saw it as a way to bring stability to the region, reduce the need for U.S. involvement, and ultimately get to a peaceful resolution.
But President Zelenskyy wasn't just going to sign anything, right?
No, he was not.
He was very clear about needing some serious security guarantees for Ukraine.
Oh, absolutely.
Not just from the U.S., but from European allies as well.
Exactly. For Zelenskyy, a ceasefire without those guarantees meant nothing. It wouldn't last. He needed to know that Ukraine wouldn't be left vulnerable if they stopped fighting. Because let's be honest, Putin had broken ceasefires before. He was not going to let that happen again.
You can see how much Zelenskyy tried to make this personal, too.
Oh, yeah.
Sharing stories from the war, showing photos of soldiers and civilians affected by the conflict.
It's powerful stuff. You know, these negotiations weren't just about some abstract ideas. They were about real people's lives. Zelenskyy wanted to bring that home. I think he was really trying to connect with President Trump on a human level. Especially because Trump, you know, was known for his kind of pragmatic and some might say transactional approach to these things.
And then there's that moment where President Trump talks about wanting to be a peacemaker. He even says that if he'd been in office earlier, the war might never happen.
It's so interesting, right? Because it shows how much he believed in his deal-making abilities. He thought he could bring peace through those negotiations. But it also makes you wonder how much he really understood about everything that led up to the war. Like, did he oversimplify the situation a bit?
And then things get a little tense, right?
Definitely.
President Zelenskyy stood his ground, and it led to some uncomfortable moments in the room.
Yeah, you could feel the friction building. Zelenskyy wasn't afraid to push back, and it created some real tension. And it just highlights how tough diplomacy can be, especially when you've got these strong personalities and such different viewpoints.
So where do we go from here? What happens next in the meeting?
Well, buckle up, because things are about to get even more interesting. The conversation turns to very specific details. The types of security guarantees Zelensky's looking for, the role of European allies, and the potential implications for the U.S.
This is going to be good.
Oh, yeah. And one of the things that really jumps out at you reading through this transcript is how often Zelenskyy talks about needing security guarantees.
Oh, yeah. He brings that up constantly.
Yeah, he says over and over that without guarantees from the U.S. and its European allies, any ceasefire would be basically pointless.
Right, like just words on paper.
Exactly.
And totally unsustainable.
Yeah, and there's this one point where Zelenskyy says that Putin has broken ceasefire so many times before.
Right.
Like, it really gets to the heart of why Zelenskyy was so insistent on something more concrete than just promises.
He even says that Putin hates Ukrainians.
Yeah.
That he doesn't even see them as a real nation.
Right.
And that he just wants to destroy them.
That's a really powerful statement.
It is.
I mean, it shows you just how deep the mistrust was between Ukraine and Russia at that point.
Yeah, it goes way beyond just disagreeing about politics.
Totally.
It's like this fundamental clash of worldviews. Like, they're coming from completely different realities.
Yeah, and it's rooted in this long history of animosity.
Okay, so then they start talking about military aid. Zelenskyy expresses his gratitude for the javelins that the Trump administration provided.
Okay.
He even compares it to the non-lethal aid that was given during the Obama years.
Interesting.
Yeah, it shows you how different those two administrations were in terms of supporting Ukraine.
It was a much more assertive stance from the Trump administration, for sure.
Right, providing those anti-tank weapons.
Exactly. But it also came with the risk of escalating the conflict.
So it's a double-edged sword.
It is.
And you can tell Zelenskyy really sees the U.S. as a crucial ally.
Absolutely.
He's not afraid to say what he thinks might happen if the U.S. backs down.
Yeah, he even suggests that if Russia pushes further into Europe, American soldiers would inevitably be drawn in.
Despite the distance.
Yeah, and that's a fear that you hear a lot in Eastern Europe.
Right.
They're worried that if Ukraine falls, they could be next. So Ukraine becomes this really strategically important place, not just for the region, but for the whole geopolitical landscape.
And then things take a really interesting turn.
Okay.
Because President Trump kind of pushes back against Zelensky's request for security guarantees. He says that the priority should be getting a deal done.
Interesting.
He talks about his deal-making skills.
Yeah.
And how he thinks he can bring both sides together.
So he's basically coming at this from a business perspective.
Exactly.
Like it's a negotiation.
Right. And Zelenskyy is focused on the long-term security of his country.
Right.
He knows that a deal without those guarantees could be worse than no deal at all.
Totally different priorities.
And President Trump says that he could be tougher than anyone, but that wouldn't help get a deal.
Okay.
It's like he's trying to reassure Zelenskyy that he's playing the long game here.
Yeah, like he knows how to negotiate, and he's not going to blow it by being too aggressive.
But Zelenskyy doesn't seem totally convinced.
You can tell.
He argues that just agreeing to a ceasefire without addressing the security concerns wouldn't be enough to stop Putin.
Yeah. He says they need strong deterrence, a real military presence, and a clear commitment from the U.S. and Europe to defend Ukraine. So it's like, how do you deter Russia while also trying to find a peaceful solution?
Right.
Zelenskyy seems to think that diplomacy alone isn't going to be enough. He thinks Putin only responds to strength.
Yeah.
Okay, so then they start talking about U.S. military aid again. And President Trump says that he's committed to supporting Ukraine.
Okay.
But that he hopes he won't have to send too much more.
Right.
Because he's hoping for a quick end to the conflict.
Yeah. And that's a big deal because there's this whole debate about how much aid to give Ukraine and what kind of aid.
And what it means if the U.S. starts cutting back.
Exactly.
It could have a huge impact on Ukraine's ability to defend itself.
Okay, so then there's this weird moment where a reporter asks President Trump about his legacy.
What?
Yeah, and he compares himself to George Washington.
Oh, no.
And Abraham Lincoln.
He didn't.
He does.
Yeah.
Then he says he's just kidding.
Well, that's good at least.
But it shows you how he sees himself.
Right.
He wants to be remembered as a peacemaker.
That makes sense in this context.
Yeah, and Zelenskyy even says that if Trump can bring peace to Ukraine, he'll be on this wall.
Interesting.
Yeah, like maybe a wall of heroes or some kind of monument.
It's like he's acknowledging the role that Trump could play.
Right.
But it also shows the pressure that Zelenskyy is under as a leader.
Right.
He's desperate for a solution.
And then out of nowhere, Trump brings up Zelensky's clothes.
Seriously?
Yeah, he points out that Zelensky's not wearing a suit.
Come on.
Even though he's like the highest ranking official in the country.
That's so awkward.
And Zelenskyy just kind of jokes that he'll wear a suit after the war is over. And maybe even one like Trump's.
That's actually kind of funny.
Yeah, it is. But it's also this weird power play.
Right.
Like Trump is trying to assert his dominance or something.
And Zelensky's response is like, I'm not playing your game.
So then they go back to talk about security guarantees.
Of course.
And Zelenskyy really emphasizes that a ceasefire alone won't be enough.
Right.
He says they need a backstop from the U.S.
Interesting.
Yeah, to make sure that any European-led security arrangements are actually credible.
So basically, he doesn't fully trust Europe to handle this on their own.
It sounds like it.
Which, is a pretty common view.
Yeah.
There's this idea that Europe doesn't have the military power or the political will to stand up to Russia without the U.S.
And President Trump agrees that Europe needs to do more. He says they should be at least equal to the U.S.
Right.
in terms of their financial and military contributions to NATO.
Yeah, that's been a point of contention for a long time, the U.S. feeling like it's carrying too much of the burden.
Okay, so then a reporter asks Zelenskyy if he thinks there will be a trilateral summit.
With Trump and Putin? What did he say?
He says that any future negotiations have to involve Ukraine and Russia directly.
That makes sense.
Yeah, he recognizes that this conflict is ultimately between those two countries. And he wants to make sure that Ukraine has a seat at the table.
Absolutely.
Not just be a pawn in some bigger game.
It shows how determined he is to make sure that Ukraine's voice is heard.
Okay, so then another reporter asks about U.S. troops in Europe.
Okay.
Specifically the ones in Poland and the Baltic states.
Got it.
And President Trump says that he's committed to Poland.
Yeah.
He praises them for their contributions to NATO. But he also says that all NATO members need to contribute more equally.
So back to that burden sharing issue.
Yep. And it just shows how complicated things are in Eastern Europe.
Right.
These countries like Poland and the Baltic states feel really vulnerable to Russia.
Of course. They see those U.S. troops as essential for their security.
Right. And then a Polish reporter asks President Trump about his message to people in Poland who are worried about how close he seems to be with Putin.
Oh, wow. That's a tough question.
And Trump says that if he didn't engage with both sides, a deal would never be possible.
Interesting.
He's trying to walk this fine line between engaging with Putin to try to resolve the conflict and reassuring his allies that he's got their backs.
Exactly.
It's a tough position to be in, for sure.
And then Zelenskyy jumps in and says that the way to peace is through diplomacy.
Makes sense.
Not through, posturing and empty threats. And he says that Trump's efforts at diplomacy are a positive step.
It's interesting, right? Because even though Zelenskyy clearly doesn't trust Putin, he's willing to support Trump's attempts to negotiate.
Yeah, he's trying to be open to any possible path to peace.
And I think it shows how much pressure he's under as a leader. He's carrying the weight of his entire nation on his shoulders.
Okay, so then things get heated again.
Oh, boy.
Trump basically says that Zelenskyy wouldn't be in such a strong position without the U.S.
Okay.
He talks about all the military and financial aid that the U.S. has provided.
And says that without it, the war would have been over in 2 weeks.
It's kind of a blunt assessment.
Yeah, but it also shows you the power dynamics at play.
Right.
The U.S. has a lot of leverage in this situation.
And it can create tension.
Definitely.
Especially when one side feels like they're being dictated to.
Okay, so then the tension really ramps up.
Uh-oh.
Trump pushes back against Zelenskyy's insistence on security guarantees. He says that Zelenskyy should be more grateful for the U.S. support.
Serious.
And that he doesn't have the leverage to be making demands.
Oh.
It gets really uncomfortable.
You can practically feel the tension through the transcript.
Yeah, and Zelenskyy defends his position.
Right.
He says that Ukraine has been fighting hard and that his main concern is the survival of his people.
It's a fundamental difference in perspective.
Right.
Trump is focused on the deal, and Zelenskyy is focused on the survival of his nation.
So in the end, Trump says that he thinks Putin wants to make a deal and that he's the best person to get it done.
Because he's dealt with Putin before.
Exactly.
And he brings up the Russia hoax, saying that he came out of that experience with a better understanding of Putin.
But then the meeting just ends abruptly.
Really?
Yeah, Trump says they've seen enough.
What?
And that the whole thing will make great television.
So we're left hanging.
Totally.
I mean, did this meeting help resolve the conflict at all?
Right.
Did all the tension and disagreements make things better or worse?
Yeah, it's hard to say.
What do you think about the potential outcomes of this meeting? I mean, what kind of impact could it have on the U.S., Russia, Ukraine, Europe, the whole world?
That's a big question.
It is.
And I don't think there's an easy answer.
No, probably not.
This meeting was just one piece of a much bigger puzzle.
Right.
And we're still seeing the consequences play out today. So what can we learn from all of this?
Yeah, I mean, what does this tell us about international relations diplomacy? The challenges of dealing with global conflicts.
Right.
This transcript gives us such a fascinating look at how diplomacy works.
It does.
At the highest level.
Mm-hmm.
You can see how personal relationships, communication styles, and just different ways of seeing the world can have this huge impact on global events.
What really struck me was how often Trump talked about the conflict in Ukraine like it was a business deal.
Oh, yeah. He kept using words like deals, leverage, cars.
Yeah, it's like he was back in the boardroom.
And that's really key to understanding his approach to foreign policy. He often applied that business mindset to international relations.
Right.
He wanted to get the best possible outcome for the U.S., but sometimes that approach didn't quite fit the reality of the situation.
Yeah.
You can't always quantify things like historical grievances or the human cost of war.
And Zelenskyy was really focused on those things. You could tell he felt this deep sense of responsibility for his people.
Yeah, and for the survival of his nation.
Right.
His perspective was shaped by that immediate threat.
Yeah, the threat to Ukraine's very existence.
Exactly.
So it's no wonder they had such different priorities going into this meeting.
It's fascinating to see how those different perspectives played out.
Okay, so we've talked about the personalities, the different perspectives.
The high stakes.
What's the big takeaway here?
I think one of the most important lessons is the need to understand different points of view.
Absolutely.
To really grasp a situation like the conflict in Ukraine, you have to be able to step outside your own framework and consider why the other side is acting the way they are.
What are their motivations?
Exactly. What are their fears, their goals?
Well, empathy is key.
It is. Successful diplomacy requires more than just negotiating skills.
Right.
It requires empathy and a willingness to bridge those cultural and historical divides.
Well, this has been an incredible deep dive.
It has.
It's amazing how one meeting can reveal so much about the world.
Right.
So what happens next?
Yeah.
How did this meeting shape the war in Ukraine? Did it have a lasting impact on the relationship between the U.S., Russia, and Ukraine?
Those are the big questions, right?
They are.
And unfortunately, they're not easy to answer.
Yeah.
This meeting was just one moment in a much bigger story.
Right.
And it's a story that's still unfolding.
So as we wrap up, what's one key takeaway you would leave our listeners with today?
I think the most important thing to remember is that peace isn't something that just happens. It takes constant work.
Yeah.
It takes a willingness to see things from different perspectives.
Right.
And the courage to have those tough conversations.
Even when there are no easy answers.
Exactly.
You know, it's wild to think that this whole meeting played out for the world to see.
It really is.
With all the tension and the disagreements and the high stakes.
It really highlights how personal relationships and communication styles can shape these global events.
And how those dynamics can make diplomacy so challenging.
Absolutely.
One thing that kept coming up for me was how President Trump kept talking about Ukraine in terms of business.
Oh, yeah.
Deals, leverage cards.
It was like he was back in the boardroom making a deal.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Zelenskyy was dealing with a whole different reality.
Right. For Zelenskyy, this wasn't just a business transaction.
Yeah, it was about the survival of his nation.
Exactly.
And that really shaped their whole interaction.
Absolutely. President Trump was looking for a clear win, something he could point to as a success.
Right.
Zelenskyy was fighting for the future of his people.
It's like they were speaking two different languages.
In a way, they were.
So where does that leave us?
Well, I think it shows just how complicated the conflict in Ukraine really is. You've got these deep historical roots, these complex geopolitical factors, and then you throw in these powerful personalities. Right. And it's no wonder that finding a solution is so difficult.
Okay, so what are the big lessons here?
Well, I think one of the most important takeaways is that to understand a situation like this, you have to be able to see it from different perspectives.
That's so important.
You have to step outside of your own framework and really try to understand why the other side is acting the way they are.
What are they afraid of?
Exactly. What are their goals, their motivations?
It's about empathy.
It is.
Understanding where someone else is coming from.
And that's crucial for successful diplomacy.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Because it's not just about having great negotiating skills.
Right.
It's about being able to connect with people on a human level.
to bridge those cultural and historical divides.
Well, this has been an incredible deep dive.
It really has.
We've gone from the Oval Office to the front lines of a global conflict.
We've seen the personal side of diplomacy and the weight of history.
And it's all connected.
Absolutely.
So as we wrap things up, what's the one thing you want our listeners to remember?
I want them to remember that peace isn't just the absence of war.
Okay.
It's something you have to work for.
It's an active process.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It takes effort and understanding and a willingness to engage with the world.
Even when it's difficult.
Especially when it's difficult.
Well said. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.